While all these players were bad in week one, they're not all falling down my rankings dramatically, right? A player can have a down week and then still bounce back and be completely fine. So I'm going to be ranking these guys from least worried to most worried, starting with Jackson Smith-Njigba. Well, yes, JSN comes out, and if you started him, you are disappointed. You get about 6.5 fantasy points. The underlying involvement in this offense was actually still very solid. I mean, if you look at this graph from PFF, you actually see that JSN played a career high in terms of his snap rate in this offense, which has just been trending in the positive direction over the past 3 weeks. This is the continued trend of us seeing more 3 wide receiver sets here in Seattle, us getting more and more JSN involvement, where you actually have 56 snaps for JSN in comparison to only 36 snaps for Tyler Lockett. So now that you're getting this type of opportunity, it comes down to one thing. Do you think that JSN is a top talent? And if you do, then honestly, he should be just fine with this opportunity. And if you don't, I don't see why he's on your team in the first place. My rankings, I still have JSN just there as that borderline flex play. He's at wide receiver 33, directly ahead of guys like George Pickens, Jaden Reed, Calvin Ridley. Talk about Calvin Ridley later on, but let's move over to Jameson Williams, who's actually right there as well as that borderline flex play, wide receiver 37. And Jameson obviously had a much worse week. Jameson only about 1.5 points. And I'm not worried about Jameson at all, because he goes from, in my mind, a boom bust field stretching wide receiver that is going to have massive games when you have the long touchdown, who at the same time is going to create a ton of value for the Detroit Lions by creating space underneath for St. Brown and this rushing attack, to now being the exact same thing that we thought he was previously. So if you were in the crowd that was just screaming at me that we were ranking Jameson too low this past week, you probably need to reevaluate. And I don't think Jameson's a locked and loaded must start wide receiver 2 here rest of season. Still very much a wide receiver that has proved that he has a very large role in this offense. And I do think that he is every week in consideration for your flex, but primarily going to be that guy that we're playing during the bye weeks or if you have injuries. Now, our next guy that I'm not going to be too concerned about is Rashid Shaheed, another player that people screamed at me that we were too low on this past week. And the reason for that is I view him similarly to how we are with JSN, where you are going to have some pretty big spike weeks. And while, yes, when the Saints are dropping 40 points a week, Shaheed's probably going to do well, especially when you have that type of passing volume for Derek Carr. Where this week he gives you the goose egg, but you have 5 targets, right? I mean, you still see him go out there and run 24 routes out of a potential 27 dropbacks. So there's nothing really that's changed with his overall usage. The Saints offense definitely comes back down to earth in this game, but I think nobody in their right mind was expecting the Saints to continue to score 40 points every single week going into the future. I have Shaheed as that bench play that you're really only considering if you're desperate with injuries or a bye. I have him currently at wide receiver 49, directly ahead of guys like Jerry Jeudy, Christian Kirk, Darnell Mooney, and directly behind players like Khalil Shakir, Christian Watson, and Jordan Addison. Now, moving over to our next player, we're actually going to be looking at a running back. With Tony Pollard, I actually expected that we were going to see more Tajay Spears. Pollard was that sell high candidate for me because we were sitting here going, it's a bad offense. I think Spears comes in and actually sees a very large role as a receiver. And while Spears definitely did have that role as a receiver, right? Spears did come away with 54 receiving yards. If you look at the underlying usage, no, Pollard was still very much running back 1A. I mean, you had 34 snaps for Pollard in comparison to only 20 snaps for Tajay Spears. Pollard still very clearly looks like he is going to be seeing 65% of this backfield, where Spears is only going to be at 35% to maybe 40%. And the only real concern that you have is maybe not with the workload, but instead the overall offense, where you do have that extremely low floor from what you can expect from the Tennessee Titans from week to week perspective. But you already knew this, right, when you were drafting the Titans, where we did discuss every single day pretty much that sportsbooks did have Tennessee at the bottom 5 of the total points scored if you were looking at implied team totals from a season-long perspective. Now, going over to our next player, we will have James Conner. With James Conner, I started him and I ranked him way too high this week. One of my worst calls is how high we ranked James Conner. And honestly, I don't necessarily think this was a James Conner issue, where you do see 44 snaps. Trey Benson really has no involvement whatsoever. My issue was we just didn't give the Detroit Lions the credit that they deserved. So yeah, James Conner comes out and he gets 9 carries for 17 rushing yards. And the reason why he's actually going to be a little bit more worrisome to me in comparison to some of these other players at the bottom end of this list is we just see the fact that you don't have the receiving floor, that sometimes when these running backs just completely faceplant from a rushing efficiency perspective and they get stuck in a really tough matchup in a really bad offensive environment, they'll go out there and they'll give you 3 receptions. They'll give you 43 receiving yards. You're like, oh, okay, this sucked, but at least I got 8 points. It's not the case here with James Conner. I mean, you only see 1 target out of the backfield. So that floor does appear to be maybe a little bit lower than we initially thought if the Arizona Cardinals fall behind a negative game script and particularly a tough matchup against a tough rushing defense. Now, Josh Jacobs will be our next player here. If we are looking at Josh Jacobs, not full-blown panicking, obviously he's very low on the list in terms of guys that we will be talking about. But at the same time, it's definitely worth mentioning the Emmanuel Wilson usage. Because I thought once Marshawn Lloyd was put on the IR, okay, Josh Jacobs going to see 80, 90% of this backfield going into the future. That just simply didn't happen. Emmanuel Wilson actually played 26 snaps in comparison to Josh Jacobs at 33. If you're looking at the touches in this offense, while Jacobs does have 14 carries, Emmanuel Wilson has 12. Emmanuel Wilson also has a couple targets out of the backfield and is the guy to come away with the receiving touchdown. So I actually moved up Emmanuel Wilson in my rest of season rankings over there on the site to being a premium handcuff back that if anything were to occur to Josh Jacobs, you should be very excited. And I did move Jacobs down a bit as well, where I still view him as that low-end RB1, high-end RB2. I think it's going to be a very good offense when you do get Jordan Love back in, but he is now down there at RB12 for me in my rest of season ranks. Now, Brandon Ayuk is somebody that has to fall from being a low-end wide receiver 1 where maybe we got a little too excited when you had no Deebo Samuel, when you had no George Kittle. I thought he was set up to absolutely crush. So now we have moved Brandon Ayuk down to wide receiver 15. And honestly, Ayuk may continue to fall. He may fall behind Olave. He may fall behind Deebo. He may fall behind Godwin. I just want to be a little more patient with Brandon Ayuk and say, okay, well, this is a situation in which he missed all of training camp. We are only 3 weeks into the season. While he comes out and while he just gets smoked by Juwan Jennings, who has 175 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns, Ayuk himself has a fine day. Brandon Ayuk does have 10 targets out of a potential 30 Brock Purdy pass attempts. Brandon Ayuk does have 5 receptions for 48 receiving yards. So it's not like Ayuk was horrendous. It's just that if you're going to be comparing him to Juwan Jennings, obviously is very bad. I still view him as somebody that I am having to get in my lineup this next week, but not necessarily a player that I'm excited about starting. Now, someone that I'm excited to see tonight is actually going to be T. Higgins, who is my favorite underdog pick for the night to go higher than 45.5 receiving yards with how good the matchup is against Washington. And if you wanted to check out that pick or any other picks on Underdog, you can find that link in the description in the comment section. And if you use promo code FLOCK, you are going to get an additional 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, on top of that, you're going to be getting a free team review in one of the live streams we're hosting every single night. And you're going to get a free Joe Burrow special pick, more than less than half total yard for the Monday night game tonight. So make sure you are taking advantage. Now, our next guy will be Anthony Richardson. Now, A-Rich was ranked as that borderline top 5 quarterback for me. Just going, okay, even if he's bad from a real life perspective, we'll have the rushing upside. Couple different things. One, I didn't account for what if he's horrible from a real life perspective? What if he's going to consistently throw more interceptions than touchdowns, while at the same time, we are actually going to see the passing volume be extremely capped, where you know, is this a week where he completes 9 passes? Is this a week where he completes 10 passes? And he doesn't have the same level of rushing upside as what you're going to see with maybe a quarterback like Jaden Daniels, where it appears that Daniels is more that Lamar type rusher, whereas Anthony Richardson's giving more of a typical like Kyler Murray rushing stat line. So I've moved A-Rich behind Jaden Daniels in my rest of season ranks. I moved him behind Kyler Murray. I now have Anthony Richardson down there at QB 8, and he's directly ahead of Burrow, Jared Goff, Jordan Love, And honestly, if you played in a 6-point passing touchdown format, I could even see moving Anthony Richardson down a little bit below this, but we'll talk about Pittman later on. Let's go over to Tank Dell. Now with Tank Dell, this is a receiver that I want to be on record. I think the offense is going to be better going forward than what it was this past week. You had 215 passing yards for CJ Stroud. You had 2 interceptions, only 1 touchdown. He took 4 sacks. Obviously, I think we can now say through the first 3 weeks of the season that this Minnesota Vikings defense is one of the best defenses in the NFL. I mean, they were phenomenal. I watched this game from start to finish. And yes, I may have been rooting for Cam Akers fantasy points. Maybe we didn't get as many as we would have liked. It is what it is. That's fantasy football. But what you did consistently see is, another target for Diggs. Another target for Nico. And this is now the 3rd straight week where Tank Dell is behind these other receivers in terms of total production. Tank Dell is locked into the 3rd wide receiver role here for the Houston Texans. This is where I had him ranked coming into the season, but I thought there was an outside chance that I was wrong. I thought that maybe Stephon Diggs was going to be behind Dell. But no, I have moved Tank Dell to wide receiver 30 in our rest of season ranks. As of now, he's right behind Flowers and Rome, and he's directly above Deontay Johnson and Xavier Worthy. And honestly, there's a chance that if you give me another day or two to think about this, Tank Dell's going to even fall a little bit further in these ranks. Now, Ezekiel Elliott is a running back where the usage is just going in one direction. That is straight down. Now, of course, you weren't starting Zeke in the first place, but I am getting to the point with Ezekiel Elliott that it's not a question of can we start him? It's a question of can we roster him? Because reasonably, what is the upside here with Zeke? Because if we're looking at the stat line from these running backs, in this backfield, it is just a straight up committee where it's not even just a 50-50 split between Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle. You are seeing Deuce Vaughn also mixing in now back-to-back weeks. Rico Dowdle plays 37 snaps in comparison to Ezekiel Elliott at 15. I mean, and I know this was a game where they get boat raced, but at the same time, if you're actually going to be looking at what the involvement for these running backs were at the very beginning of the game, it was Dowdle over Zeke. So I moved Zeke down to like RB 47. I just don't see a path where this guy ever hits your starting lineup. And honestly, I may even be moving him down a little bit below this when we get to think about it a little more. Now, Calvin Ridley will be our next wide receiver. So DeAndre Hopkins obviously comes out, and Hopkins dominates the targets here in Tennessee. And what's very interesting to see with this as well is with Hopkins coming back from this knee injury, he's still not an every down player. You actually only have 25 snaps played for DeAndre Hopkins, but you also have Burks in, you also have Boyd in. And so Calvin Ridley, his actual usage in this offense comes back down to earth just a bit. He only runs 31 routes out of a potential 44 dropbacks. DeAndre Hopkins only runs 22 routes, but Hopkins is the guy that actually dominates the targets. So this is the issue that you have when it comes to these very bad offenses. These very bad offenses, historically speaking, we really don't see anybody produce to a wide receiver 1 or very rarely even to a wide receiver 2 level. In the instance that they do, they have to be absolute alphas. They have to be seeing 35, 40% of their respective passing offense. Look at Malik Neighbors with the Giants right now. We'll talk about him in the Rising video. That's going to come out later today. But now if Hopkins does have this type of target share in Tennessee, I think you have to move Ridley down. Ridley's now somebody that I was just kind of fine penciling in to be in my wide receiver 2 slot at the beginning of the season. To now he's that borderline flex hovering around the same ranking of like Jameson Williams, Brian Thomas Jr., Michael Pittman, who we'll talk about in a second. Now our next little trio of players will be the Miami Dolphins. Now, obviously, we already went through and we already moved the Miami guys down significantly last week. Last week, they would have been the number 1 on this panic video. But just checking in on where we stand with every player in Miami. Last week, we were saying abandon ship, get out while you can. Obviously, it was going to be very hard to sell Tyreek, going to be very hard to sell Waddle because everybody knows, hey, Tua's out. These guys are going to go down. I mean, definitely think if you could back then, if you can still now, I would love to sell Achane for Amon-Ra St. Brown. I would love to sell Achane for Justin Jefferson. It's probably very easy to do after last Thursday night's game. Now it's probably a little bit tougher. But regardless, just where we stand, I think Jalen Waddle continues to be unstartable until Tua comes back. Once Tua does come back, he's going to be a high-end wide receiver too. I think Tyreek Hill is somebody that you have to start, hope for a big play from. I think Tyreek goes from being the wide receiver 1 in fantasy down to a high-end wide receiver 2. And then I think Devon Achane is a running back that you have to start. If you have Raheem Mostert missing, then Achane's going to be that locked and loaded mid RB1 based off of volume and usage in the receiving game, even in the garbage offense. If Mostert does play, then actually at that point, I think Achane looks a little bit more like a low-end RB1. But regardless, you're starting Tyreek, you're starting Achane, and then you're benching Jalen Waddle until we see a situational change at quarterback, which hopefully the Skylar Thompson injury kind of makes this team realize, hey, we have to go out there. We have to get somebody. Obviously, we can't start Tim Boyle. Now, our next guy that we are going to be looking at will be Sam Laporta. Now, this is what hurts me. Not only do I have Waddle on my team, but I also have Laporta. And it's not like I just drafted Sam Laporta in the Flock League either. I took Sam Laporta in so many freaking underdog drafts in round 4. I would love to come out here and say, oh, I wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong, guys. He just got injured. He just sprained his ankle. It's actually going to be a good day today. He was actually going to have a top 3 tight end finish. No. He was trending in this direction anyway. A lot of people speculating that this was a hamstring injury that he dealt with in training camp, maybe lingering into the season. Maybe that's why we haven't seen him at full effectiveness. But regardless, Laporta's been somebody that you would be better off not having in your starting lineup. And now this sprained ankle is maybe going to finally give me an excuse to actually go down and bench him. Now, to be fair, it has only been 3 weeks. He has still put up the best tight end rookie season of all time on his resume by far too. So whenever I'm saying that he's falling in my rankings dramatically, he had already fallen behind McBride, but now I think he also falls probably down to tight end like 5 or 6, depending on what Dalton Kincaid does this next week. And also dependent on the injury updates that we're going to be getting at the beginning of this next week. And a big injury update that you're going to have to be on the lookout for will be Justin Herbert. The Herbert injury update not only impacts Herbert himself, but it impacts Dobbins. It impacts Ladd. It impacts Quentin Johnston. There is nobody that is startable in Los Angeles if Justin Herbert does not play. Now, I will say this past week, of course, credit where's credit's due. We did have Dobbins as a sell high candidate. However, he actually did expand his role in this offense. You actually did see Gus Edwards pretty much just turn into legitimately nothing whatsoever. And Dobbins does look to be the feature down back in Los Angeles. The issue is just Taylor Heineke is your starting quarterback here. Even if it's a rush first offense, it's still going to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL. So Dobbins is a low-end RB2 / flex consideration / maybe if you have a good team, you throw him on your bench. And we really need Justin Herbert to be okay. Now, we already talked about another player that's freaking on my team that's on this list, Ramondre Stevenson. With Ramondre, obviously, this is the Thursday night game, so this is old news by this point. But I just want to reiterate, this is the risk that you have with players that are in garbage offenses. It doesn't even need to be their own faults. They can still go out there and do everything right, but if their offense can't pick up first downs, can't make trips to the red zone, not only is your ceiling capped because the touchdown upside's not going to be there, but at the same time, your floor is going to be significantly lowered as well, where it is in the range of outcomes for you to get 0.3 fantasy points just because your offense can't pick up a first down. Now, Zamir White will be our next guy here at 6. Zamir White actually falls to a range where, similar to Ezekiel Elliott, it's not about can we start him, and it's more about can we cut him. Now, I'm not telling you to cut Zamir White just yet. Very weird usage trends that we've had with this offense in Las Vegas. Week 1, Madison plays more than Zamir. Very weird. Week 2, Madison almost doesn't play at all. Zamir plays like pretty much every single snap, but obviously the offense abandons the run, so it doesn't really matter. And then in week 3, Zamir looks like he almost gets straight up benched. He plays behind 2 other running backs in terms of snaps here. So you are one more week away in my minds where we see Amir Abdullah and Alexander Madison out snapping Zamir White. Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with the overall game environment where the Raiders fall behind. They're throwing it. But this is going to be often for the Raiders, right? I mean, you're not necessarily expecting the Raiders offense to be winning the majority of these games. Now, going over to somebody that has featured this list, God knows how many times. We got to talk about Rachaad White here. If you are looking at Rachaad White, the underlying usage is okay. I mean, he's playing 42 snaps compared to Bucky Irving at 18. This is just now the third straight week, coming off a year of inefficiency as well, where Rachaad White has been one of the most inefficient running backs in the entire NFL. Looking at Rachaad White, the thing that you need to see is in a full PPR format, the receiving volume is there to save him and to give him that floor. Where you see this week, you get about 7 points just as a receiver. So even when he falls flat on his face as a rusher, it's maybe not the worst thing in the world. Because the snaps are still there, because the receiving role is still there, I can't move Rachaad White to a range where he's like not startable. But I have moved Rachaad White down to RB22 because if you look at the efficiency between Bucky Irving and White, I am very concerned that Irving's going to continue to expand his role in this offense, which is naturally what you'd expect for a rookie that's currently outplaying the starter. That may change in the future, but it is what it is. Now, of course, this list in this video may just turn out to be about my entire fantasy team because now let's talk about DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift is even more inefficient than Rachaad White. DeAndre Swift has picked up one rushing first down all season. DeAndre Swift had the best matchup you could ever imagine going up against the defense that allowed the most rushing yards in the entire NFL. DeAndre Swift has averaged over 15 opportunities per game through the first 3 weeks, and he has done the least with the most. Roschon Johnson looks better at every touch. Roschon's now playing in this offense. There is a 0% chance that you could start DeAndre Swift. I can't believe I convinced myself to do it. Travis Homer on the IR, good matchup. I went, I guess this is a horrible call, horrible mistake. I almost want to just cut him. That way I don't have to make the mistake again. Now, Jaylen Warren last week actually split the backfield pretty much 50-50 exactly with Najee Harris. Off the top of my head, I believe both running backs saw 31 snaps. Well, this week, not only does Jaylen Warren fall dramatically behind Najee, but Jaylen Warren also falls behind Cordell Patterson. And I still think that Jaylen Warren's going to be ahead of Cordell Patterson. I think this was a unique situation with this game. But if Patterson's involved really at all, this isn't a good enough offense for Jaylen Warren to be in a 3-man running back by committee and be viable in fantasy. So at this point, Warren has fallen down in my rankings to RB36, where he is alongside some of these other names like Trey Benson, where you're just a handcuff. If the starter goes down in front of you, then yes, I mean, if Najee Harris goes down, Jaylen Warren's a must-start player, of course. But just somebody that you cannot come close to considering if Najee's healthy. Somebody else that I'm willing to just kind of wave the white flag and say you cannot start anymore is Michael Pittman. If looking at Michael Pittman Jr., this is a wide receiver that actually has some target competition coming in now, where Josh Downs sees 5 targets. So Michael Pittman Jr. only has 5 targets in an offense that doesn't have a ton of passing volume to go around with in the first place. Obviously, this is primarily maybe an Anthony Richardson issue. I don't want to blame it all on Pittman, but I moved Pittman down to being like a borderline wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 in my rest of season ranks. I'm pulling up the week 3 ranks on the site just so I can see where I ranked him. Yeah, I had ranked Pittman at wide receiver 31 this past week. And yeah, there's no way in hell I can rank Michael Pittman Jr. there going into the future with the usage of Josh Downs and the continued just horrendous passing volume here in Indianapolis. And then the player or / players that I am most worried about is Mark Andrews. Andrews is at this point somebody that you have to bench. I don't see how you could potentially play Mark Andrews. Looking at this data from PFF, Mark Andrews played 21 snaps, and Mark Andrews ran 6 routes. Charlie Kolar played more than Mark Andrews this past week. Mark Andrews was the number 3 tight end for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, I think a lot of this had to do that they were just running the ball over and over and over again. You had 45 total carries in comparison to 15 Lamar Jackson pass attempts. So I think a lot of this was due to scheme. But if this was a one-off instance, then I would say, okay, let's ignore it. But this is the continued trend. You can see it with this snap chart from PFF. So I don't know. This is plan A for this Baltimore Ravens team. If they can get to a lead, they want to run it. Even in the games that they've trailed, or the game that they trailed, we saw more Isaiah Likely than we did Mark Andrews. So I'm very, very concerned here. And yeah, I do want to put a little asterisk. I know some people asked about Mike Evans in the comment section. Evans had a tough matchup. Don't panic about Evans at all. He's going to be just fine. Does not move a single spot down my rankings. But I really hope I was able to help you out here. And of course, if you enjoyed it, go down there, hit that like, subscribe, play fantasy football. And if you play fantasy football, I know you're going to love Underdog. My favorite pick on Underdog this week is T. Higgins for more than 45.5 receiving yards. Great matchup against Washington. And you can find that link in the description, in the comment section. If you use promo code FLOCK, you are going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, promo code FLOCK will get you hooked up with a free Joe Burrow pick, more than less than half a total yard. And on top of that, you're going to get a free team review from yours truly in a live stream that we're doing every night. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your Underdog account. That way I can accredit you with that free team review. That's all I got for you. I really do appreciate you. Really hope that you have a great day. And I'm going to be streaming after the game tonight, of course. So I'd love to see you then.